This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. Well, this is a podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I am the host, John Moorhead, and I'm privileged today to have as my guest Kelly James Clark. And I'll read just a portion of his bio. The complete bio will be in the program notes, along with a link to the book that we'll be discussing today. Kelly James Clark is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. Kelly has held previous positions at Grand Valley State University, Calvin University, and Gordon College, and visiting appointments at Oxford University, the University of St. Andrews, Peking University, and the University of Notre Dame. He is the author, editor, or co-author of more than 30 books, including his new book that we'll be discussing during this podcast, titled Raging Fire of Love: What I Learned from Jesus, the Jews, and the Prophet. And welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
Well, at the top, I also want to thank our mutual friend who helped make this possible, Fred Stella. He's been a prior guest on this podcast as well, so he shared his Hindu background. So thanks to him, and thanks again for you coming on. Before we get into your book, I would like to hear a little bit about your story. I have, it's blurred in the background, but in my library, I have your work on interfaith, which we're going to be talking about today, but you're also a philosopher. You've done some work in the cognitive science of religion. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how these interests have come together over the years?
Yeah, I suppose my initial interests in philosophy and in philosophy of religion were mainly trying to prove that my beliefs were true, and only my beliefs were true, or to prove that I was rational, and well, not only me or only my beliefs, but people like me, basically very conservative Protestant Christians. And I know in college I was anti-Catholic, definitely anti-Muslim. Jews sort of got a free pass because we thought they were all closet believers and God was going to bring them into the kingdom in the end of times. The story of my book and the story of my life is how I came from being a person that wanted to prove that their own beliefs were true, their own religious or Christian beliefs were true, to beginning to open up to and understand and have sympathy for and respect for people who had beliefs that were really different from mine. And the biggest move, the first big move, was thinking that Catholics might be okay. And I'm sort of embarrassed to say things like this, but that's just the way it was back then. And then finally an even bigger move, and it was many years later, towards respecting and honoring Muslims. And I write about that, the transformations that I made in my book. I tell a lot of stories. I tell my own story in the book as well. My own story, kind of from Protestant fundamentalist to I don't think Islam is true. I'm not a Muslim. I'm not a Jew. I still align myself with Jesus and Christianity. But I've begun to think that most people most of the time are doing what I do, trying to figure out what's true and what right and what to believe and how to live their lives. And I'm not really special. I think that I thought I was somehow special. And I view that as a kind of spiritual pride. So I view my journey as one of trying to acquire, or being forced to acquire on occasion, some sort of spiritual humility.
Well, I'm wondering, just as a follow-up, if a part of that initial journey for you, I don't know if got hung up is the right term, but did you have a detour in a strong apologetic kind of approach? I came years and years ago out of a Mormon sect, and I got very involved in what's called countercult apologetics. And eventually I just came to the point where I had to ask myself the question, how do I live faithfully as a Christian amidst those who choose not to accept my religious tradition. There has to be more than apologetics, and I got involved eventually in religious diplomacy. Was there anything similar in your journey?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was quite smitten with apologetics, and I was sure that reason would lead people only to beliefs like me and my tribe held. Of course, I was only getting information from people who were like me and in my tribe, and you learn how to be suspicious of people um, who are not in the tribe. And so if they're saying something different, you know that you should be suspicious of them, not just because they believe something different, but because they're kind of like tempters, uh, devilish, and so they're not even good. People who disagree with you, they don't even rise to the level of being good. So you have to be suspicious of their motives all the time. And I was totally taken with Christian apologetics and trying to prove my faith and trying to prove it to other people. I was very evangelistic, and I would use my great reasons to try to convert people. Um, and so, yeah, totally. Sounds like we have similar backgrounds.
Now, how did your journey eventually take you into interfaith arenas? It's one thing to kind of come out of apologetics to a different place, but you can still be somewhat isolationist.
Yeah,
How did you get to the place
yeah,
where you actually wanted to encounter the other and have more of a back and forth with them?
yeah, yeah. The first was kind of forced on me. I went to the University of Notre Dame for my PhD, and as you know, Notre Dame is a Catholic school, and a lot of the best philosophers there and the best theologians there are Roman Catholics, and a lot of the students were Roman Catholics. And I went in to Notre Dame. I'm from Michigan, so I thought Notre Dame was a little iffy in terms of its sports programs, but I thought it was even iffier with respect to its theology. And I had thought going into Notre Dame that all Catholics were going to hell. And I got to Notre Dame and I met Ralph McInerney and Fred Ferdoso and Ernan McMullen and any number of prominent Catholic philosophers. And after a while, I just couldn't find myself believing that they were going to hell. Like I thought that they had sincere faith in God, that they were trying to live their lives according to how they understood their faith in God. And I could no longer think that they were somehow insincere, that they knew like theologically salvation was by grace alone or whatever Protestants believe, and that they had willfully rejected that in their own lives. I just couldn't believe that anymore. And it was more the power of their uh, not the power of their personality so much, but they just friended me and were kind to me. And I just couldn't think that they had some sort of superior, or that I had some sort of superior faith to them. It just was, the relationships were transforming. And I'd say that's a similar thing happened with Islam. I knew after 9/11 that Christians were likely to mistreat Muslims and to be bigots towards Muslims. I knew that all Muslims would be blamed for what a handful did. And I'd written about liberty and tolerance for almost 10 years, academic articles. And as you know, hardly anyone reads any academic articles. I think the average is about a number of readers of an academic article published in a refereed journal is about 3. And since my mom tried to read most of my articles, I was down to 2 academics maybe who maybe read anything I wrote. So I'd written about 10 articles on liberty and tolerance, and I thought, well, like here's a test. For Christians, I had written that tolerance is a virtue, that we should honor and respect people who are different from us and who disagree with us. And even though I'd been brought up to think Muslims were bad, evil even. Even though I've been brought up that way, I just thought, even if you think that, you're still supposed to tolerate them. And so I began to write more specifically and start to work more with Muslims on issues of liberty and tolerance, and to get people to talk about that from their faith perspectives. So the first book I published on the topic was Abraham's Children, Liberty and Tolerance in an Age of Religious Disagreement. And it was published by Yale University Press, and Jimmy Carter wrote for it. Abdurrahman Wahid, the former president of Indonesia, wrote for it. He's an amazing leader for tolerance in the Muslim tradition, and he was the leader of a Muslim group called Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia. That's the biggest single Muslim group in the world, over 50 million Muslims, and one of his key teachings was tolerance towards people who are different from you. So he's a great guy. And I knew nothing about him before I wrote the book. I knew nothing about any Muslim scholars or thinkers before I began working on that book. But I knew that this was, and I also turned 50. And I was thinking philosophy should be more useful, or I should be less abstract, an ivory tower. And so I wanted to be more in the public square with philosophy, taking ideas out of academic journals and then into people's lives. So that was part of my story, but it wasn't until later that I really had transformative experiences with Muslim friends, and they were unbelievably kind and showed unbelievable hospitality, and that's really what changed my view of Islam. That these are people who were born in a different situation, have a different information set than I have, and they're doing their best to be faithful to God as they understand it. So I just couldn't any longer think that, even though we disagree, that they were irrational or were doing something bad or wrong. I thought they were doing the same thing I'm doing. They just did it with a different background and information set and came to different conclusions.
I appreciate that background and that part of the story. I think these interfaith relationships are indeed transformative. Let's unpack your book a little bit, Raging Fire of Love. It's got a foreword by the Dalai Lama. And in the introduction, you mentioned the influence that he's had on the way in which you deal with this subject matter. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah. So the thing that really attracted me to the Dalai Lama and his work on the topic was that I had gotten Desmond Tutu to write a blurb for Abraham's Children. And it's a funny story, if you don't mind.
Sure.
There were several Peace Prize winners that wrote for Abraham's Children. I didn't get any Nobel Peace Prize winners, although I tried to get a few of them. But evidently there's like a club of Peace Prize winners. So the Peace Prize winners knew Nobel Peace Prize winners. So they said, you should get Desmond Tutu to write a blurb to this. And I said, well, I don't think I'll be able to get a hold of Desmond Tutu. And they said, well, I know somebody who knows him. So they wrote to 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners, copied me, and asked them if they could send me Archbishop Desmond Tutu's personal email address, which they did. And I wrote to Archbishop Desmond Tutu and asked him if he'd write for the book. And he wrote back, he says, well, I'm over 80 and it's getting hard to do things like this. I really like the book. I think it's a good idea. I'm not sure I'll be able to do anything for it, but I'll think about it. And then he signed it, Love, Arch. And one thing I'd learned writing that book was how you get to famous people. And what I learned was if you can get to their assistants and get them to agree to do something, then they can probably get it to the famous person if you can't get directly to them. So And that's how I got to Jimmy Carter. I knew somebody who knew his assistant, and then she approached Jimmy Carter. So I thought, well, I'll write to Desmond Tutu's assistant at the same time. And so I wrote to her and I said, ask if she could, ask him to write a blurb for this book. And she wrote back and immediately and said, no, he won't be able to do it. He's too old and he likes to do these things. I'm sorry, but he won't be able to do it. And I wrote back to her because in the meantime, I had received my Love Arch email. So I wrote to her and I said, I don't know if this is a joke or if I have the right email. So I forwarded it to her and she read it. And she says, no, that's him. Love Arch, that's him. So that's how I came into contact with Desmond Tutu. And he ended up writing something for that book. So I approached him to write something again for this book, but something longer. And in the meantime, I saw a documentary with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama on joy. And they are two joyful. The documentary is really interesting. And I liked them both. Just personally, Desmond Tutu is a really charming, funny, empathetic, kind man. He is a really wonderful person. And comes through in this show, and he sometimes he just provokes the Dalai Lama and gets the Dalai Lama to laugh. And I thought, you know what? I'm gonna see these two work good together. I'm gonna see if I can get the Dalai Lama to write for the book. And long story short, I knew some people who knew some people and ended up getting the book to the Dalai Lama's assistant. And he said the Dalai Lama likes it and give him a few weeks and he'll get back to me. And he got back to me with an introduction. I have no idea if the Dalai Lama or his assistant wrote it, but somebody clearly read the book. The comments, the forward was applicable to the book. I was very happy, and I was happy they accepted. But that's how I met the Dalai Lama. But in the meantime, I read what he wrote on universal compassion, and he wrote from a more Buddhist perspective, and I'm working from a more Abrahamic perspective. So I thought the book needed to be written that was kind of like his, but from our tradition, my own tradition. He spoke of what he was good at, and I got to speak about what I was good at, and that was understanding Christianity the best, Judaism second best, and honestly, it's been a learning curve to learn about Islam and what it says about love. But I thought I could tackle it. I as a philosopher, I worked with ancient texts, with medieval texts, with modern texts, with Chinese texts. I thought, well, I'll just figure Islam out. And I had some help doing it. I had a Jewish philosopher friend and a Muslim philosopher friend who helped me with both those chapters.
I'm wondering also in terms of the Dalai Lama's influence and the way you approach the subject matter. You mentioned his work on compassion, but you also mentioned the documentary on joy. And it seems to me, at least in my experience working with other Christians in a multi-faith arena, we don't experience and draw upon a lot of compassion or joy in relating to either other Abrahamic religions or non-Christian religions in general. There's a lot of defensiveness and hand-wringing and that kind of a thing. So was that more compassionate, joyful kind of approach that you saw in his writing and his approach? Was that kind of a big influence in your approach to this book?
Yeah, I mean, I was already pretty far down the road in cultivating, I think, the virtue of listening to people who are different from you and thinking that was good, that you had things to learn. I've been at this for a long time, not interface so much, but trying to understand people who are different, and I've changed who are different, who hold beliefs, who are different, who look different, who have different color, maybe have a different accent, maybe their names are different. I remember my first trip to China. I directed a program in China, and I remember a lot of Americans laughing at the Chinese names like it was funny, and then mocking them, saying it in a Chinese accent and saying the names wrong. These are American philosophers. Some of them are pretty famous. And the Chinese were very nice about having their names mispronounced. But all of us know we like to have our names pronounced properly. It's a sign of respect. And so one of the first things I did, and it sounds simple now, was I wrote phonetically when we'd go around a circle and people would introduce themselves. I listened really carefully, and which is hard. I think names from people in other traditions, like they don't fit into our name database very well. My name database works really old: John and Michael and Jane and Cindy, but not so well as Xu Xiandong or Li Changqiu or something like that. So anyway, and so what I did, I remember the first couple times that I went, I didn't pay attention and I didn't work at it. And I just thought, no, I'm going to work at this. And so I would learn how to pronounce everybody's name. And anyway, I learned this one simple little thing. People like to have their names pronounced correctly, and it creates a bridge. It's a tiny little bridge. It's one little step across two fairly wide chasms: US capitalism and Chinese communism. And then, you know what I found out? The Chinese, a lot of them weren't really communists. And I met some Chinese Christians. I met some Chinese theists, some Chinese agnostics. I met hardly any Chinese communists. Um, but when you start listening, you start learning about people who are different from you. And I feel like I'm a long way away from whatever question you asked me, and I don't remember exactly the question, but anyway, the joy and stuff. I feel like I've been taking steps now for 35 years, just trying harder to listen to people who are different. I'll tell you one story where I really noticed this. In around 2000, 2001, 2002, I was at a World Congress of, wasn't philosophy, it's just the World Congress of something, I don't know, in China, and they put a lot of money into this. There were experts from all over the world in everything, in every field you can think of. And they had a philosophy section, but they also had a section on biochemical medical engineering. I mean, it was massive how many people they had there. And one of the philosophy sessions, the brother of the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the supreme leader of Iran, was there. Not Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the revolution, but Khamenei is the one that replaced him. And far as I knew, Iran was in the axis of evil, and we were the great Satan. And the guy got up there, the brother of the Ayatollah Khamenei is a philosopher, and he got up and gave a talk. It was kind of an attack on the United States. And I was thinking of just getting up and walking out. But then I remember I tell my students to read sympathetically people who are different from them and to listen sympathetically to the ideas they have. And I said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to set aside my biases and just listen to this guy. And what I heard was ideas that didn't sound so bizarre. What I heard was, we oppose McDonald's because we're not crazy about McDonald's, put it that way, because we don't want the whole world, we don't want our culture, our ancient culture, to turn into yours. We have our own culture, we have our own values. And we're worried about the internet because we don't want our kids to become addicted to pornography or there are values that are communicated on the internet that they don't fit with our values. Anyway, he sounded a lot like a lot of Christians that I knew, that you have to be wise in raising your children and being part of a culture, but not absorbing that culture. And anyway, I never said a word to him. I listened and I learned from him, and he didn't sound so different from what I thought a lot of Christians think about many of these issues. It's just that he didn't want Iran to become like the U.S. And I don't blame him. There, the U.S. is, we think we're the bright shining light on the hill, and sometimes we are, but sometimes we're not. And we have a dark side, and he brought up the dark side. And anyway, I think sympathetically listening to people who are different from you is a project I've been involved in for a long time. But I had to learn it. Like, I had to unlearn my tribalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to cultivate respect and honor for people who are different from me. So by the time I heard the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Tutu, it was a breath of fresh air to hear two religious leaders from really different traditions do it. And I appreciated what I saw in both of them. But I was already sold on the virtues that they both exemplified.
Now, with the title Raging Fire of Love, can you talk about, just kind of summarize the basic thrust? How are you looking at love in the Abrahamic religions, and how much similarity do they have, and how much difference at the same time?
So I'll just say something about the title. Raging Fire of Love comes from the Song of Songs, which is the only text in each of the three traditions that's devoted solely to a discussion of love. And it's, for your readers who haven't read it for a long time, it's mostly a love story about two, I assume, adolescent lovers. It's not clear that they're married. It's pretty clear that they're not married, by the way. It's the wooing stage. The book is mostly about the wooing stage. It's pretty explicit, although it's hard to see how explicit it is, because the images are ancient and rural and primitive, rustic. But I think she says one time she talks about the garden, come visit me in the garden. And then she says, now come rest in my garden. And well, it's pretty clear. It's almost erotic, actually, the love, the way the love is described between these two young lovers. Well, it was a mystery why that book would be included in the canon of Judaism and then Christianity. And what early Jewish thinkers said was that it belongs in the canon because it's a metaphor for God's love for Israel and God's wooing of Israel and calling Israel, and then calling Israel back to God. And there's one line in there that talks about sealing upon one's heart the raging fire of love. And I took that as the title because a lot of people in all three of the traditions think that love is just an act, not fake. It's not it's not appearance, but all it is action. What people do, that's all it is. So love is an action, I suppose, is a better way to say it. And what I discovered in each of the traditions was that it also includes motive, and motive is the raging fire of love. And I thought that needed to be brought back, that I don't just have to act in a certain way towards you. I'm supposed to start to feel in a certain way towards you. And the way I'm supposed to feel, the raging fire of love, is empathy, compassion. I don't try to get too technical about the term, but there's a positive, fiery feeling that you're supposed to have towards those towards whom you act in love. So the action matters, but our motives matter probably more. And then, the motives matter more because the fact is we're way more unlikely to act in love if we don't care about somebody. And so the book is about cultivating caring or empathy or compassion. Um, and it notes that love can be pretty easy between people we care about, but it gets harder towards people further out of our kind of inner sphere, our nuclear family or our religious group, our own tribe, and then it gets harder and harder. Islam talks about our near neighbor and our distant neighbor. All the religions talk about stranger and how we should treat stranger. And I take it strangers are people for whom we don't have any natural empathetic tendencies. And then each of the three traditions even say that we have to love our enemies. And these are people not only that we don't care for, we may have negative attitudes towards people we don't care for. And the part of the point of the book is to recover this raging fire, that what we need to do is figure out how we can love people who are different from us. And that means how do we cultivate those positive feelings, the fiery feelings of love towards people who are really different from us. So I'm very skeptical of people who think love is easy. Love may make the world go round, but it's hard. It can be hard with our own kids, and it's the easiest with our own kids because we have a biologically inbuilt fire of love for our children, and yet they can be really hard to love. And that fire of love diminishes the further away people are from, like, our kids, our family, our community. And then, so how do you cultivate that? That's what the book is about. And it's trying to bring that back into these more academic and sterile discussions of love, which leave out the raging fire, that want to say love is just an action. That's it, in each of these traditions.
Well, you bring up some great things for consideration, the emotions, the difficulty of love, which is why I'm skeptical of a lot of traditional interfaith and peacemaking approaches, which really assume kind of a more liberal modernist mindset. Well, just love. But as you point out, the other that's perceived as enemy and maybe even psychologically, morally, belief-wise, worldview harmful, those folks are difficult to love. And in the first chapter of your book, you discuss an emotion related to that, the emotion of fear. Why is fear so important for us to recognize, and what types of fears are Christian Jews and Muslims facing in regards to relationships with each other?
Yeah. The first chapter is called Fear and the Failures of Love, because I think the real enemy of love is not hate. The real enemy is fear. And I think fear is our most primal and palpable motivator. We're really motivated by fear. Fear can move us fast in the opposite direction, and it doesn't even have to be justified. I know one time I was walking in the woods at night, and I thought I heard a little noise on the away from me a little bit, and I looked over and I saw a face, and I was scared to death. And I thought, well, I better check on this. My family's not too far away. I better go check. And so I walked over, and turns out when I got close, it was two like little circles in a tree where branches had come off, and I thought they were eyes. And when I got close, I saw it wasn't a face. It was just these things in a tree. But I'll tell you this: you asked about cognitive science of religion before. I will tell you, I saw a tree. We see things in holes, and we see faces, and all it takes for us to see faces are two relatively concentric eyes. That's all it takes, and we can see a face. We can change what we see when we get closer, but my visual experience was of a human face. Anyway, that scared me to death, and if I had been out alone, I might have run. That's how scary it was to see this face. So fear can be really powerful and create, um, it can create biases that move us away from, not just move us away physically, but move us away intellectually, morally. Uh, we can, so you and I shower a lot. We're Americans. We use close to the same soap. Maybe we use the same cologne. We're in roughly the same tribe, but early human beings could tell based on smell who was in their tribe and who wasn't, because early human beings ate slightly different food and had slightly different sanitation habits and maybe had slightly different fabric in their clothing. So an early human way to tell who was in your group and who wasn't was by smell. And so I make this point because this is what we think of our own group. We think our own group smells good, but we think people who are different from us stink. And why is that? Because people who are different from us in the early human communities were possible competitors. They don't have to be, but they might be. We know people in our group are cooperators, but people outside of our group are competitors. And if they're scarce resources, then they might come and take your food or take your wife or take your child. We know that. I think early human beings were really motivated by fear, so much that the slightest smell could set off a fear reaction that there's a person there and that person may be there to harm you. So I think fear is really primal and powerful. And it makes it hard to love people who are different from us. It can make it impossible to love. And I think we see a lot of contemporary politics of fear, by the way. Um, and I think it's not good because we think we've come to fear immigrants. We've come to fear the Muslims. We've come to fear brown people. And what that does is it makes it hard for us to love them. We feel okay about dividing them, children from their parents, for example. That's okay. Or shipping them back to a country when they grew up in America and only speak English. Though fear is really powerful, and it's being preyed upon by politicians. So how do you? But the Bible says we're supposed to love everyone, and that means that we have to, I think, come face to face with our fears. I give an example, and I tell this when I've told this at Al Azhar University, the most important Muslim university in the world, for 1,000 years in Cairo. I've said it. I've given this example in Muslim universities in Turkey, in the United Arab Emirates. I tell Muslims this story, and the story is my first trip to Iran when I had kind of stopped thinking them as on the axis of evil. I had many Iranian friends, so I couldn't think of them. They had disabused me of thinking that being a citizen of Iran meant that you weren't a really wonderful person. But I still had this kind of lingering fear, I guess, of going to Iran. And I was flying over, and the pilot said, "You have entered Iranian airspace." And all the men on the airplane said, "Allahu Akbar," in unison. And I thought I was going to die. I thought, Allahu Akbar, the suicide bomber is going to push the button and the bomb's going to go off and the plane's going to crash. And well, all it really was a bunch of devout Muslim men saying, praise God. That's what Allahu Akbar means. But to me, it meant the thing a suicide bomber says before they kill everybody. My heart started beating fast. I'm up looking around at what's going on, and I had to talk myself out of that fear. And what this told me was, even though I've been involved in interfaith conversations and trying to build bridges, I still have these fears. I still have this bigotry and I still need to work to overcome it because I know if I have it, it's going to prevent me from loving people who are different from me. Um, and um, so the book, in some ways, is identifying our fears and being honest about them. Because, oh, you ask about a lot of interfaith things. I find a lot of interfaith things to involve mostly people over 65 who are really nice people now, going like this. Aren't we all nice? Don't down deep, don't we all love each other? And all I want to say is down deep, most of us don't. And we need to find ways uh, to bring people that are really different and don't feel very favorably towards people who are different from them into dialogue. Those are the people that we need to have involved, and they're really hard to get involved. But a lot of interfaith discussion, I think, is what's called virtue signaling, us finding ways to say how nice I am, how nice my religion is, and how nice your religion is, and how nice you are. But lots of us aren't nice. You know, the world's in a pickle. And God bless you for doing the work you do. Got to be done. We don't do it, the world isn't going to ever be a better place. And I actually think the divides are getting worse. So getting people who really fear each other to face each other and learn to listen, that's really hard. But that's the work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment. I think a lot of people who participate in interfaith are already inclined for various reasons to do so. And it's the ones who don't come to the table, the ones that we need to get there.
Yeah.
I'm glad you shared that story about fear. I've got my own stories, working in the backyard in Utah and just pulling up weeds. And for a fraction of a second, I think I see a snake. And I'm
Exactly
not afraid of snakes, but I jumped back and my heart was racing, and it only took a few seconds to finally realize that's not a snake. I'm not afraid of snakes, but it was that primitive part of the brain that just kicks in and takes over. And so many times we're just reacting to our fears.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with this idea of raging love, what would your recommendations, your suggestions be on how we can, once we practice being more aware of the fears that we have of the others, whether it's their politics, that they want the same land that we want, that their worldview is different, we might consider it heretical, whatever the fear is. How do we apply love in those specific concrete situations to make a difference?
Yeah. So you just identified some of the causes of fears. So I think religion is almost never the source of our most primal fears, but we do have deep fear over land, like people who want to take our land. And that's what's going on in Israel and Palestine. Israel wanted land, came to a land, thought it was their land. Palestinians thought it was their land. That's what the fight is over. Also autonomy, the Palestinians. So you mentioned government. People don't want to be ruled by outside forces, I guess, is the best way to look at it. They don't want to feel subservient to power. So people fight against that. So they fight for liberty. They fight over land. If our children are attacked or a family is attacked, we fight probably most immediately when we feel that our children or our family is under some sort of attack. Religion is almost never the deepest cause of any conflict that people have. It lies there. It's on the surface, so it can be the easiest way to identify people. But by and large, people fight over these more primal instincts. And what can we do? I have I don't know. So I don't know how much longer we're going to talk. So at the very end of the book, I talk about how the traditions have what are called rituals of love, that there's no easy thing to do. In my book, I'm not the easy answer person. I point out what the problems are at the very beginning, And then I point out what each of the traditions says about about how we're supposed to love people who are different from us, all the way up to enemy, and they're different about how that should happen and what that means. So I try to show the differences, and then in the end, at the very last chapter, I say it looks like we have an almost impossible ideal. Here we are, creatures of fear, with pretty deep instinct primal fears. You had one for the snake. And everyone has an inbuilt instinct to fear, well, at least to run away from snakes and even to panic. It's deeply inbuilt in people. Uh, and then we're supposed to love all the way up to enemy. And it looks like maybe these are not just in conflict, but impossible. Like we have this impossible ideal. And then what I talk about in the book at the very end is that each of the traditions is trying to transform us from being fearful and selfish and tribal into people who are who have get some control of their fears and move outside of their tribe. And so I look at how the traditions try to get us to do that and point out that it takes a long time for that to happen. And before I get to that, I just want to say one little simple thing that I think people can do. And that is this: walk out of your front door and walk down the street and knock on the door of your Muslim neighbor or your Jewish neighbor and talk to them. And ask them if you can go to their mosque or go to their synagogue, or invite them over for a cup of coffee. And don't talk about religion, just talk. Ask about their kids or their jobs, or what color paint, why'd they pick that color paint? Ask about anything but their religion. And just have a friendship. One thing I say in the book is that all love is local, that we want, God may love the world, but we love one person at a time, and we need to learn to love one person at a time. And we're not taking advantage of all the opportunities. We're bad neighbors most of the time, and we're bad friends. And so I think one simple way to develop, to build bridges with people who are different is just to be a friend to somebody who's different. And that takes some courage for people to get out of their own communities and walk down the street. But I can tell you, the person 4 doors down who has brown skin and different beliefs from you do, and goes to a different church and didn't come from Italy, but came from Pakistan, or their family did, they're not going to kill you. Go knock on the door and have a conversation and invite them over for a cup of coffee and do that a few times. And I promise you they will reciprocate. They will probably do better. They may invite you for a Ramadan feast break meal. So I find Muslims way more hospitable than Christians. But at any rate, you ask about what do you do? Well, there's this simple thing all of us can do, and that is go and meet our neighbors, and our neighbors who are different, and start to cultivate friendships. And then I think other advice that I think the traditions have is to spend your life working on cultivating the virtues that you need to become the kind of person who can love people who are different from you. And all the traditions, I think, recognize that it's not easy. And so it's so not easy, you have to do these rituals over and over and over again. And maybe after a lifetime, they catch. I think that's and I can talk about the rituals if you like, or I can wait till later, but I think that's
Yeah, talk about some of those if you would.
Okay. So at the end, I talk about how hard it is for selfish, fearful people to become lovers of people who are really different from them. And so I discuss first the Muslim daily prayer and what the Muslim daily prayer means. And I remember the very first time that I really encountered Muslim prayers. I had thought that Muslims prayed 5 times a day just because they were like trying to get God's attention, or curry God's favor. I guess that's how I would say it, that they wanted God to think they were pious. And so they deserved to go to heaven. That's the only reason they did it. And I got invited to a home for dinner of a Muslim family in Istanbul on my first trip. And uh, then I heard the call to prayer. And then the Muslims in the room left the dinner table one at a time. And they were gone longer than someone might be going if they were going to the bathroom or something. So they were going longer than I thought. So I couldn't figure out what was going on. And finally, after about the fourth person left and the first three had come back one at a time. So what are you doing? And they said, well, we're praying. And I said, don't you go to the mosque to pray? And they said, no, we have a room. Most Muslims have a room that's dedicated to prayer. You don't go 5 times a day to the mosque. And I learned later that malls have a room for people to pray, and schools have rooms for people to pray, and businesses have rooms for people to pray. And they said, well, look, come in, I'll show you. And so one of them went into their room, and like I watched them pray. I was a spectator. And I said, well, what is it that you're saying? Because it was in Arabic, and they don't speak Arabic. They're Turks. They speak Turkish. And so they told me that they're praying to Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. And then they repeated that. They pray to Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. And they bowed down. And I'm not a bower downer. I didn't grow up in the Protestant tradition. I mean, sorry, in the Catholic tradition or the Episcopalian tradition. I don't bow down. In fact, I was taught that was bad. But here I am watching this person bow all the way down, their face, their forehead on the ground. And they're bowed down before the Almighty. And they're praying to compassion and love. And I'm thinking, the point is not that you're showing off with your body. The point is that spiritually, you're supposed to get yourself in a position where you're 5 times a day. What you're really saying is there's one God. Sorry, I forgot this part. There's one God, Allah, the compassionate and the merciful. And partly, I think it's an unselfing exercise where you get your body bowed down. And part of what you're saying is, I am not God. There's just one. I'm not the most important thing in the universe. The world doesn't revolve around me. And I think we think that a lot, by the way. I think the primordial sin in the Garden of Eden is, ye shall be as gods. And I think we forget that. We don't realize how godlike we think of ourselves, how we elevate ourselves and put down other people. And so I began to think the first step towards loving other people is both realizing you're not the center of the universe, but also you're connecting to love, the compassionate and the merciful. And so I know a lot of Muslims, it's just a rote practice for them. But I think if it's not a rote practice, I think the point of it is that it unselfs us. And it other orients us initially to God, but also to love. And that's the first step. And each tradition, by the way, has something like prayer that's supposed to not be mostly asking for, to pass this test or to get a beautiful spouse or to make a lot of money. Prayer is supposed to be about saying, thy will, not my will, be done. It's to orient us towards God. So I think all the three traditions have something like this prayer ritual. And that's the first step, I think. And then the second step, I talk about Shabbat or Sabbath, the Jewish Friday meal, and how they come together in a group. And I discuss it at length here. I discussed the first Shabbat meal that I was invited to and what I saw in this meal. And and what I think what you see is people coming together. It's not just family members. You also you could invite extended family, you could invite neighbors, but they're coming together for 24 hours and they're not working. And so they're not creating. So again, I think they're not being God. That's the reminder, and they're ritual reminders this whole time. But they're also learning how to love people, other people. And so learning how to love happens in a family or happens in a community. That's the place where we learn it. And so they learn it. They learn their place, and they learn how to love and care for each other in this Shabbat meal. And so you've got a sort of breaking away from self in the Muslim prayers, and then a uniting, learning how to unite properly and have raging fire love for people who are in your basically your tribe. But we got to get out of our tribes. All three traditions call us to love people who are different from us. So I discussed the virtue of hospitality in the Christian tradition. And I point out that the virtue of hospitality is not evangelism. A lot of Christians will have people come to their house because they want to share their faith. But hospitality is not about what your guest does. Hospitality is about what you do. And it's a virtue that you acquire. And what you do is you open your home, you create a safe space. And I talk about how in the early Christian tradition, if a stranger walked by, you're supposed to invite them in. Well, strangers could take everything you have. It was way worse then, way riskier business then to practice the virtue of hospitality than it is now. And yet, all three traditions say when a stranger comes, you have to invite them into your home. And then you invite them in, and then you show them compassion. You wash their feet. That's humility. That shows that you respect and honor them. And then, so it's all about your attitude, and you have to cultivate this attitude, and that you show compassion and concern. So the virtue of hospitality is about the host, not the guest. And it's about becoming the kind of open, generous person that freely invites people in and creates a safe space, a home. And that's a really hard virtue to cultivate, but it seems to me that's the virtue that gets us out to the world, out of our tribe and out to the world. And those are three virtues, unselfing or unselfishness, and love of family, where we first learn love. This is our spiritual home. But then moving out then into the world and having an open, generous spirit, a spirit of listening, a spirit of bridge building, a spirit of creating a safe space for people who are different from us.
Well, we've been talking for about an hour. As we draw our conversation to a close, are there any last thoughts that you would like viewers and listeners to take away from the book? And again, they could find a place to download a PDF copy and all that in the program notes. But just last thoughts to encourage them that you'd like to pass along.
Yeah, I'll just say, and I'll just repeat this. I think overcoming our fears takes a lot of courage. I think I don't want to diminish the courage involved in this one little thing, and that is walking out of your home, your safe space, and down the street and talking to someone who's different from you, and then inviting them into your home. But I think that for human beings is the lesson of love. It's not your and my job to create peace in Israel, Palestine right now. It's your and my job to love our neighbor as ourselves. And I think that means, like, literally walking down the street. Lots of times we don't even know the names of our neighbors 3 doors down anymore. We're not very good neighbors. And so I don't know, start with this one thing. Let's be better neighbors. Walk out and knock on their door and invite them into your home. That's love.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks so much. This has been Kelly James Clark. Thank you again for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, John. And it's good to
Of
see you face to face.
It is. And I'm glad to finally touch bases after enjoying your work over the years. And again, I want to direct folks to the links in the program notes. The book we've been discussing is Raging Fire of Love, What I Learned from Jesus, the Jews, and the Prophet. And I would encourage folks to download it and give it a read and put what we've been talking about the last hour into practice. Again, thanks to everybody for watching and listening. Until the next episode of Multi-Faith Matters.